Hello, everyone. Drew Noel here, coming at you with the Revenue Riders podcast. I've got Jason Salzman with me as well, and our guest this week, Andrew Vontz. Andrew, thank you so much for joining us.
I'm excited to be here. I'm excited to talk revenue and writing. Let's do it.
That's a perfect alliteration combo. I wanted to kick it over to Jason to intro you, and considering the two of you have interacted in the past, Jason, take us away.
Yeah, absolutely. Excited to have Andrew on. Andrew and I have been connected on socials for a long time, playing in the same spheres. I think I originally connected when I was still racing, and Andrew was still at Strava, which I guess dovetails nicely into Andrew's 25 years telling and shaping the stories of the world's top performers, brands and businesses, including his time as the VP of comms at Strava. And then, he's currently starting another company with a former Strava executive. He has headed up content at a number of other companies, including athletic performance company TRX. And he has spent time now putting together his own content for Choose the Hard Way, a podcast about how hard things build stronger humans, something we've already talked about a bunch on this Revenue Riders podcast. And he co-hosts Beyond the Peloton, the leading pro cycling analysis podcast. He is a lifelong cyclist, and we're excited to have him on to talk all things revenue and all things riding.
Let's do it.
So cool.
Yeah, to kick it off, Jason, I was for about a decade, I was a journalist, and I wrote for outlets like Rolling Stone, Outside Magazine, the Los Angeles Times, and broadly I wrote about people, places, and things at the limits of human experience. But I have to say, that experience did not equip me to decode what is on the whiteboard behind you. And I'm, the crisis management professional in me is just thinking, do we have an OPSEC problem right now? Is there anything proprietary back there, or did somebody just scribble that a bunch of stuff on the whiteboard?
I scribbled that on there to make me look smart.
Okay, great.
It's the same reason I wear glasses.
Yeah, totally. Okay.
There's definitely, I see a sigma, so at least there's a sigma back there.
Yeah, sigma, a couple of numbers.
Sigmas, some deltas, most of the rest of the Greek alphabet.
There's an equation up there. It's looking good. Yeah. Maybe this is a fraternity recruiting whiteboard. We don't know.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
No, this is just us trying to figure out what we're having for lunch.
Perfect.
Excellent.
Super rad. So Andrew, shot you some questions in advance, as we do with pods. And, one thing that I think, we're probably most interested to talk about just to kick us off and get us into it is what's been, your most recent athletic adventure, right? What's been something that you did recently, and it could even be as much as getting out for a ride or a run or some sort of activity this last weekend.
Yeah, totally. Currently, I'm preparing to do the Belgian waffle ride, Kansas. I grew up in Kansas City, which is in Missouri, and just across the state line, about an hour away, is Lawrence, Kansas, which is where this BWR is taking place. And my Beyond the Peloton co-host, Spencer Martin, is from Lawrence and went to college there. And we've now done probably, I think, 70 episodes together, and we have never met in real life. So the part of the purpose of this trip is to go do this event. And I'm semi-retired from doing gravel races, but I'm coming out of retirement for this one, at least to participate and have some fun. And I do want to confirm that Spencer is not just a chatbot. I want to make sure that this is a real human that I've been co-hosting a podcast with for the past 2 years. So I'm going to find out next weekend. So yeah, I've been putting time into getting ready for that, and just finished up. I'm in the taper for the big event, and just finished up the last big hard rides over the weekend, which I did by myself. And I don't know about you all, but sometimes when you're getting close to an event that's a lengthy event, those final big hard rides can be a little bit boring.
Yeah.
but it's part of the process, right? So it's like, can you
Yeah.
get out there and do the thing that will enable you to go then do the thing?
Yeah. Absolutely. I actually
Yeah.
ran into the same thing a couple weeks ago. I did my fastest ever double metric, and it was flat, but it was funny because I was out there for 6 hours and 20 minutes by myself, just pounding the pedals. And like I have this tendency to rip through a bunch of podcasts while I'm just out there on country roads. And it's you're right. It's like it can be mind numbing, and also when you're in that endurance zone, you're like, okay, it's almost more mentally taxing staying in that zone than it is just like riding hard. So yeah, with you on the mental grind that comes with
Yeah.
that.
Yeah, it can definitely be a grind, and something that I personally like to do before I do a lengthy event. If something's going to take longer than 3 hours in particular, I actually like to make sure that I do something that is actually harder than the actual event about 2 weeks out from the event. So I would say the ride I did this past weekend, from like a normalized power and like caloric expenditure point of view, I anticipate being harder than what I'm actually going to do next weekend. But for me, that always increases my confidence about, I mean, at the very least, I know I'm going to be able to finish the event, and
Yeah.
hopefully it'll make it a little bit easier when I get there, because I've made myself do something on my own that feels a little bit harder, which I actually think, going back to kind of the topic of this podcast, I think that that's one of the things that can transfer from participating in endurance sports over into the professional domain. And I, also to kind of give a counterpoint to that, I also have Joe DeSena, the creator of the Spartan race, the entrepreneur. I'm sure you all are familiar with Joe. Super successful guy. Started out on Wall Street, made a fortune, and then started doing Ironmans, adventure racing, all this stuff, and eventually built this business empire around helping people go find ways to move past their limits through these adventure race style events. I've got Joe on my podcast coming up. I think I'm dropping that episode next Wednesday, actually.
Nice.
And, we talked about that. Is there a point at which, when you're doing endurance sports, where the return on an investment from a like grit, resilience point of view actually diminishes, because you're just going out and doing things that you're familiar with and doing them over and over again? And if that's the case, then what are you actually getting out of it? And does it potentially actually become just like a bit selfish and a bit of a time sink at a certain point in time?
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
Yeah. What do you guys think about that?
This is one where, right, all of a sudden when an endurance ride isn't 4 hours, right, you can't cheat endurance. Is one of those things where, from an early, the early days doing anything, endurance isn't actually as long. But as you get more and more proficient at, whatever the activity or endeavor is, all of a sudden, an endurance ride isn't 4 hours. An endurance ride is 6 hours, and you can't cheat your way, fast forward through the first four. You have to go out and you have to do those 4 hours, those 5 hours, and then it's the last hour that really, makes the difference. And it's what pushes the boundaries. It's what, makes you more and more proficient at the thing you're doing. But it also is selfish, right? What is the diminishing return on that extra hour spent every time you do it? And I mean, I guess that's both a question, and I think personally my answer is that, I guess when you sit on both ends of it, if you're really trying to be the best at what you're doing, it's absolutely worth it. But if you're trying to balance more than one thing and figure out, okay, how do I want to budget my time for different pursuits and find balance, then it becomes trickier.
Yeah, completely. And I think it also is related to whether there might be something new or different to try that might push you into a more uncomfortable space that might create personal growth, or I don't know. There are a lot of other things you potentially could do with your time. You could be out volunteering and helping people. I mean, I know a lot of people, myself included, do that in addition to doing endurance sports. But yeah, I mean, there are kind of an infinite number of things you could do with your time, and you have finite time, and yet you have to stack rank what's important to me as a human being, and how do I then allocate that time to create the impact for myself and for the people around me and the world.
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
So I guess maybe what are some of those things that you're thinking of as ways to, off the bike, away from, maybe even away from, your vocational world, fill that time and make the most out of it.
Yeah, for me, I think of the most important job that I do is being a dad. And so, that's super important to me, is being there for my family, and not just being physically around my family, but being present. And I think for anybody listening to this, that I think that can be an incredibly challenging thing to do, not just to make time to be with people, but in the time that you have with them, to show up and be a present person and like be fully there and engaged and open to whatever's happening, whether it's good or bad, or a temper tantrum or whatever's going on. And I think that it probably sounds like a really simple thing. I don't find it to be easy personally. I find it to be really challenging. But I think that that's a critical thing, whether it's showing up with your family, volunteer work that you might do, organizations you might be involved in. You want to show up and be fully present and not stuck processing something that's happening in another domain of your life. And I actually would say that for me, one of the biggest learnings from having now done 100 episodes of my podcast, Choose the Hard Way, which you can find everywhere you listen, and at choosethehardway.com, at hardwaypod on Instagram. I think something that people often misunderstand about high performance, and I've had the privilege in my professional life as a journalist, as an executive, and now as an entrepreneur, to be around, and podcaster, to be around some people who are among the very best in the world at what they do. And I think you can listen to other people and hear about their paths and what they've done to do the things that they do. And I also think it's really important to remember that you are not them. And you've lived the life that you've lived with the inputs that you have in whatever context that you're in. And the thing that no one else has that you have is your you-ness. So like whatever it is that makes you is actually the most important thing that you can bring into any situation. Your perspective, your point of view, your synthesis of all the inputs that have come into making you the human being that you are, and finding a way to find like the ultimate maximum expression of who you are is the thing that like you truly can't. You could go listen to a gazillion podcasts, read every personal development, management book, biography, and you're just not those people. And there are some common denominator things that you can do, but also you want to become that maximum version of yourself. And that's how I think people can achieve their full potential. And I also think that if you can connect to that idea, which again, I think it's a relatively simple idea, but in practice, it's a very difficult thing to execute. Just be present to who you are, stay highly attuned to what you have interest and curiosity in, and ways that you can make your best and highest contribution in business and in life and with your family, with people you care about and love. And that's something that I think is kind of non-obvious and that gets lost frequently in culture.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think, one of the things you touched on there is, there are a handful of common denominators that, you share with other people. in trying to find that maximal expression of you. And I think one of the things that, brought the three of us together here is the endurance athletics common
Yeah.
denominator. And, I think, definitely from a personal level, that has been one of the ways through which I find my own maximal expression. And it seems to not only help, maximal expression in that domain, but it helps the expression of who I am elsewhere, right? Whether it's as the place where the bike is the place that I reflect on everything else in my life, on those long endurance rides when I get bored, or through, some of the other ways in which, you learn the grit, the determination, the work ethic, the ability to react to things at 30 miles an hour,
Hmm.
both figuratively and literally. I'd love to hear a little bit about how both of you think about that domain and think about how it, both is a core piece of your life, augments the rest of your life, and really, the interplay between endurance athletics and everything else.
Yeah, for sure. For me, endurance sports, and I like cycling specifically because cycling is what I've always been in love with. And, I enjoy hiking and I guess some other endurance endeavors. But for me, cycling is really the thing that I love the most. I love doing it. I love consuming content about it. I love making content about it. And I think for me, when I think back about why am I in love with bikes, and I don't know, why have they become kind of this central organizing principle in who I am as a human being and what I'm doing and like why I'm on earth. I think that for me, bikes always represented freedom. And from a very young age, I remember getting my first bike, which was a Schwinn Stingray that I still have, which is potentially kind of weird, but it's a cool
That's
bike.
amazing.
It's worth hanging on to. It's hanging up in
Correct.
it's hanging up in the rafters of my parents' garage in Kansas City, and it wasn't even like a cool bike at the time. It was kind of a relic, but my cousins had learned how to ride a bike on that bike. It was handed down to me, and from the point at which I got that bike, it gave me a feeling that I loved. And then when I was a young person, I grew up at a time when you would leave your house in the morning on your bike and like go hang out with kids in the neighborhood, ride around on your bike, get in trouble, throw crab apples at each other or shoot BB guns, stuff like that. And then you'd go home at the end of the day. And then later in life, I got into riding bikes with gears through a family friend. And yeah, before I had a car, that just gave me the ability to cover longer distances and just get away, be by myself, think, see new and different things. And I kind of felt like I was flying when I rode a bike actually, and it connected me to a just like a transcendent sense of freedom. And later I would get into competitive cycling. I've done kind of, except for track, pretty much all forms of bike racing. And I wouldn't say that I'm a gifted athlete at all, but I'm someone who works hard, and through working hard, I achieved a moderate level of success as a competitive cyclist. I got second at the Unbound 100 twice.
Legit.
Did some. I love cyclocross. I did a lot of cyclocross racing when I was living in the Bay Area, and going back to the beginnings of my career as a journalist, I started working as a freelance journalist when I was getting my MFA in creative writing in the late '90s, and I worked at a bike magazine for about the first year of my career. And I think part of what I valued about the experience I had as a journalist in relation to cycling, I wrote a daily column about the Tour de France for a couple of years during the Lance era for Fox Sports Online, and wrote about pro cycling quite a bit for Outside Magazine and other outlets, in addition to writing about a lot of other topics for other outlets. But I got to spend time with World Tour level riders. It wasn't called the World Tour at that time, but pro cyclists who race things like Paris-Roubaix, the Tour de France, whatever. And when I was living in LA in the early 2000s, we also had a typical group ride would have people like Tony Cruz, who was a domestique on US Postal. We'd have people like Kale Leo Gran, Rashawn Bahati, just like all kinds of total hitters out on the ride. And that gave me a sense of, what being truly great as a competitive cyclist actually looked like. And I knew even when I was training 20 hours a week, like I wasn't going to touch that. So I think that gave me some perspective about like, okay, like what does truly world class look like within this discipline? Where am I? And even though I saw that delta and knew I don't think any amount of hard work was going to turn me into a Tony Cruz or someone riding in the world tour. But it was just a lot of fun. I love being part of that community. I love what I learned about myself. And I think also, with competitive cycling in particular, or even if somebody listening to this, if you pick an event, I don't know, whatever you're into, if you're into running 10Ks, marathons, you like to go do Go Rug challenges, whatever the case may be. I think once you just like pick something in the future that's like a big, perhaps even scary goal that you're not sure you can complete, much less compete in, I think it becomes a center of gravity. And then everything else kind of snaps into place. And you learn all of these things about yourself. And you also, if you do enough of these things, you also, on the logistics side, there's just so much to figure out. And I think for me over time, cycling, it became more than something that I was participating in and sometimes competing in. It really became this mise en place for my entire life. So everything was kind of organized around cycling. And even if I wasn't racing, I'm somebody who just loves to train. Like I love being on an organized training plan. I love working with a coach. And over the years, I've had the chance to work with some amazing coaches. The coach I'm working with right now is Zach Nair. And if anybody's a fan of pro cycling, Zach is a very high level pro cyclist and also e-racer. He actually just won the whatever the esports version of the Vuelta, which I saw it on Instagram one day. I was like, wow, Zach, that's pretty incredible. And he's also
I spent a lot of time racing against Zach
back
in the day.
okay.
Yeah, we
Cool.
were, I think, plus or minus a year or two in
Nice.
age, and came up through the ranks, going head to head a bunch.
Yeah.
He spent some time in California as well. Lots of
Amazing.
racing, lots of battles back and forth. And I mean, he was good. He was good on the road, and he's even better when you put him on a trainer, which is something unique.
Yeah, that is a pretty unique characteristic. And part of what I love about working with Zach and all the coaches that I've worked with, I like to pick coaches who are, I mean, Zach has a very unique perspective, I think, because of his experience as an e-racer, his background in exercise physiology, and also the power analyses that he does for Velo News of World Tour Racing. So it's just really fun to talk to him about the pro side of the sport and then what he's learning through doing esports and just protocols from exercise physiology that I think are like fairly cutting edge, and to experiment with those things in my training. So for me, it just never gets boring. I'm somebody who loves to go out and do intervals and just see what happens over time.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
I'm with you on that in terms of the structure, and it's funny, in terms of that relative approach to being world class, or for me, I mean, I rode a bunch as a kid, grew very similar to you, like mobbing around on mountain bikes, like through like empty lots, like in like the burbs, right? Like kind of like experiencing that, and then really came to the competitive side of the sport as a masters athlete, and now very committed to that, committed to having a coach, willing to do the work, right? But it is funny because that experience of like the difference between what you are able to bring in terms of your you-ness, right, that you mentioned earlier, and what we get out of the sport is so interesting. And the thing I always go to is Nielsen Palace coming home to the Sacramento area. And I ride the river ride regularly.
Oh,
And
nice.
yeah, so he came out to the river ride one weekend as he was preparing for Worlds a couple of years ago. And he went off the front, and he's off the front by
Right.
himself in the wind doing like 35,
Right.
and we're all doing like 500-watt turns at the front, trying 75, 80
Yeah.
guys, like
Yeah.
trying to close this gap, and he's just sitting off the front, like, whatever, come and get me. And that's the difference. It's like you're like, oh no. That's the difference between what we're up to and what's world class,
Yeah.
but we're enjoying the exact same road. And
The
that's the
hard, the
beauty of
hardest,
cycling. Like,
the hardest racing I ever did was sitting in the middle of the field in Sibiu in Romania, and I had a 340 TSS day sitting in the field, getting right in, and it was because the Dimension Data or Quebec at the time, and the Bora guys were sat on the front, and they were narrow roads, and it was rolling and undulating, and you kept going through in and out of towns, and they were probably having an easier time on the front than I was. But that was really the eye-opening thing of, okay, no, I've spent a lot of time racing at the Conti level,
Right.
against pro Conti riders, and understanding that, okay, yeah, I can play in that domain fairly well, but there's a different level, and it's not
Right.
the 1 or 2% that I think I can get better. It's the step function to these guys who sit on the front and ride 35 miles an hour or
Right.
50K an hour and do it all day. And I'm absolutely miserable back here in what should be an armchair ride all day. And it's going to be the hardest day I have on the bike all year.
Yeah. And I think, maybe it's a bit different now that there's greater transparency about data and people have a much better understanding of power-based training. But yeah, I'm thinking back to, I don't know, like 2005, 2006, when I'd be out at the Rose Bowl or on the Montrose ride in Southern California. Just, these rides that are monuments of SoCal cycling. And yeah, I mean, we had guys like Thurlow Rogers, he was huge in the early, I don't know if you guys ever raced against Thurlow, but
My dad raced against Thurlow
okay.
a lot.
I mean, Thurlow could still probably kick all of our asses is my read on it. But I mean, yeah, like Thurlow rode at the 84 Olympics, I think.
Mm-hmm.
And, was on La Vie Claire with, I believe he was on La Vie Claire with Lamond and, right? So, I mean, yeah, guys like that. And then, yeah, like trying to sprint against Rasan Bahati at the Rose Bowl, who probably had done 100 miles before he came there. You know what I mean? But yeah, like Tony Cruz would be out there on the Montrose ride, just exactly like you're describing. Just like, oh, Tony Cruz is ridden at the front for 50 miles and everyone's just trying to hold on to his wheel. Like, no big deal. It's like, yeah, that guy's he's on another level.
Yeah. But it's beautiful that is, so this is a really interesting thing. And I think there's a corollary here between, I would say, modern business versus maybe traditional business and the accessibility, right? That, what's so fascinating with the sport of cycling, especially, or just endurance sports in general, you look at like the Mont Blanc was recently won, and you see the fans like literally intermingling with these world class runners, right?
Right.
And these types of events where it's like, yeah, there's no line of separation. You're all doing the exact same contest. You're just doing it at different levels.
Yeah.
And I think there's an interesting point about business and career now where that's something to keep in mind, is that we are all doing the same functions. We're just doing them at different levels, maybe. And for all of us to each individually improve, that, and yes, I mean, we're all working with different initial inputs as well, right? But we all have the ability to improve. We all have the ability to harness those resources and potentially make gains, like we do in athletics, just as we do in our professional lives. And also, I think it's becoming more and more acceptable to very simply reach out and ask for somebody's time on a professional basis, especially with, the interplay of media and social media. Maybe breaking down those lines, as long as people know that you are welcome to actually reach out. And I think that that's pretty fascinating in terms of that aspect of it becoming more real, right, and more transparent around how people can approach these levels of operation, or relative levels of operation.
Yeah.
Well, and that's how we. No, go for it. I was just gonna say that's how we all. That's how the three of us came together today, right? I think at some point,
Yeah.
Andrew and I started talking, just spitballing ideas about content. What has to be about a year ago, and that's what got us connected. To start was the passion for sport and endurance athletics. I think I probably also wanted a job at Strava at the time, but we'll leave that on the side.
I've applied twice. I applied twice.
Yeah.
One jobs at Strava, guys.
Yeah. We're not the only ones. I might be the only person that has 5,000 activities that's applied for a job at Strava, but
or you might not be.
Yeah, probably not. But anyways, it's one of those interesting things to see, that even just within the four walls of this podcast right now, that collaboration and that openness to communication and learning and sort of creating community, within whatever your domain is, whatever your interest is, be it personal or professional, has really started to open up, and it's one of the more interesting things and paths forward. I think both for learning business development and for how people tackle sort of the go-to-market function as a whole.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what we were just talking about in the context of, I think it's actually if we just like keep analogizing about endurance sports and business, I think something that's interesting to think about here is, going back to, hey, we have more data than ever before, both in endurance sports. And I mean, it's also the case in business, like whatever branch of business you're in, whether you're a creative director or you're in finance, you have dashboards for everything. You have infinite cloud-based tools. I just love talking about those cloud-based enterprise tools. And, to make the most of that data, I was just talking about working with coaches. And again, something that I've done is I've had the opportunity in endurance sports. I've always sought out and worked with coaches that I feel are world-class, that have different or unique points of view that I think can introduce me to new concepts or ideas that can help me get either to train more efficiently or to train more effectively. So before Zach, I was working with Tom Cuddy at Calibrated Coaching. He's based out of Bozeman, Montana. He's an exercise physiologist, high-level mountain bike racer, and, just like a really fantastic thinker on these topics. So, I learned a ton from working with Tom. Before that, I worked with Tucker Olander, who was a high-level cross racer and then started his own coaching practice. And way back in the day in LA, my first really serious coach for my not-so-serious cycling activities was David Brenton, who was a former Olympian. He's now, I believe, a Masters world champion in track, or he's definitely a Masters national champion. And, David raced BMX, pro mountain bike, pro road, and was an Olympian on the track, and then was a stuntman. He's an amazing person and like quite a character. I've had him on Choose the Hard Way. Had such an interesting background, but seeking out, definitely, yes, as Drew and Jason both mentioned, seeking out mentors or people in your network who are open to having a conversation is great. And I think knowing when to turn to other people to work with more formally. So, working with a coach or, whatever the case may be, to help you in areas where you really want to accelerate. And I think also going back to the group ride, if you're going to be out there with the Nielsen Palace or in your career, if your goal is like, hey, I want to get I want to get onto the executive team eventually. I want to be an entrepreneur. I want to be a founder, whatever the case may be. Then you know what? Like get in the mix and like go to the front of the ride and take a poll. I mean, don't be cocky, but like do something to contribute in whatever context you're in. And like, what do you know or what can you do that's going to be helpful to the group and elevate the team? Or if you're going to reach out to somebody in your network who you'd like to have a meeting with, think about like what can you do to be helpful to them, whoever you are, because there probably is something that you can do or something that that would be really helpful to whoever you're going to talk to versus just showing up and hoping something magical happens and leads to you getting that job you want or whatever. Which that's cool too. Maybe that happens sometimes, but
no, it's about raising your hand. It's about taking that poll, right?
Yeah.
It's so funny. Like I still view that when I'm on a group ride. If I haven't like won the sprint in a group ride like 3 or 4 times, then I have no business like sitting in and preparing for the sprint. It's almost like you have to do that work, do the pulls, and win the sprint in order to actually earn the right to be the dedicated sprinter, right? Like it's like you don't get that position without contributing to the overall flow of the ride of the peloton that you're with.
Yeah, completely. Absolutely.
Yeah. I don't know. I think like we could maybe bridge into, the slight extreme soloist attitude that some have seen like, arise in the gravel scene like because of that. It's a little bit like, well, wait a minute, like this is an individual sport that also plays as a team or has team elements. But then of course, we know that the terrain and the dynamics of, especially, since you're preparing for this gravel event, which is a major event on the gravel calendar, you know it's very different in terms of its format. And I think that also like plays into, right, what types of businesses are you involved in, what types of go to market motions are you involved in, is there space for totally becoming a star as almost an individual contributor, or is it really more about the team dynamics?
What do you think, Jason?
I think one of the interesting things I think about is, right, in terms of a bike race, you sort of, right, in terms of a breakaway, especially, you have your teammates du jour, right? It's those people that, situationally, you end up in this like game theoretical situation where I'm still trying to beat you. Maybe I'm still trying to win a deal that you're a competitor for, to make the business parallel here. But, we're working together in the meantime to stay ahead of everyone else and, to get that leg up, right? And you think about it in terms of teams that sit on the front together, taking pulls to bring the break back for their sprinter. You think about it, in all of these different ways, where you end up, situationally teammates, and you build a rapport by doing that day in, day out, race in, race out, and starting to think about it that way a little bit more instead of just, yes, at the end of the day, we all want to win the race, or we all want to generate revenue, or whatever it might be, to keep drawing these analogies. But there are multiple ways to get to it, and a lot of it requires cooperation and repeated cooperation at that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Andrew,
This is where my game theory nerdery starts to come into it.
that's what's on the board back there. That's what's on the board.
Yeah, exactly. I don't know if there are enough deltas on back there to really get into the game theory, but
Awesome. Andrew, as a career storyteller, I don't want to put you on the spot or anything, but the biggest thing that I think is something we love to hear, and we've heard it from our initial guests as well, but would love to hear kind of the most top of mind or emblematic illustrative story that you have to maybe share with our listeners, either in your own story, or maybe from the pro ranks that you've covered, that might
or
be
from
of
the
inspiration or interest?
or from the 10 million Strava users that you
Sure,
had
a
to
bit.
help tell their stories.
Yeah.
It could go in so many different directions. I mean, I would say, you know, in everybody's career, there are crucible moments. I mean, or actually, yeah, I think in different ways, everybody has crucible moments in their careers. And, I can think of many. And those are kind of like your 8 Mile moment where it's like you've got the mic and it's like your turn to spit bars. Can you do it or not? And you also you have to work hard to put yourself in the position to get that chance to do the thing. And then once you're doing it, I mean, you're absolutely being judged. Like, can you do the thing or can you not do it? Can you perform under pressure? Can you deliver in a high stress, high consequence environment? Because if you want to achieve in your career, you know, that's ultimately the crucible where you will operate if you're operating at the highest level and doing the coolest things, I think. And I also want to connect this to what we were just talking about, which is, Jason, you were kind of talking about the game theory, and I'm assuming that most people listening are kind of familiar with the dynamics of the co-opetition that has to happen on a group ride or in a bike race. But it's like, yeah, you have to have a degree of cooperation to get into a breakaway, for example, and then you need to cooperate in the breakaway to stay away. And then at a certain point, you're watching your competitor to figure out what are their weaknesses and when can you break them off or impose your will so that they mentally crumble and you can win. And also very few people ever end up in a position where that can happen. Now, when you're in the context of your professional life, it's a little bit different, right? But also there are some similarities because you are on a team of individuals. If you're lucky, you're working in a context where you feel mission orientation. I know, at least for me and everything that I've done in my professional life, I've really had to do things where I felt deep mission alignment. I don't think I could operate in environments where I didn't feel very deep mission alignment with what I was doing. Whether the time I spent as a freelance journalist for a decade, working at TRX for Randy Hetrick, the former Navy SEAL who started that business, and what they were doing both to make training accessible and impactful for all types of people, whether it was people with physical disabilities that would have made it hard for them to do any other types of training modalities, or senior citizens, really young people in the military, people in the most elite military units. It truly was a tool that worked for everyone. And I saw what that tool could do, and I also joined TRX while the GWAT was going on, and I worked on the team that produced our tactical training product, both the physical product and the education that went with that. And it became very widely used in all branches of the military, and that made me feel good that the work that we were doing was helping people to stay mission ready for when they went downrange and we're going to be in theater doing things. And same thing for other things that I've done. So I think doing something ideally where you feel mission alignment with people working towards a common goal, and then also just to apply the filter of reality. Also, everybody's looking out for themselves and wants to get the very most out of their career. They want to get the promotion, they want to get the raise. And I know I've had a lot of people who are come from a special warfare background, special warfare, special operations on my podcast. And I know that one of the things that people with that background have shared with me is that sometimes when they cross over into the corporate world, they bring that filter of mission alignment and mission orientation from their previous career where it was truly life and death. And now, I don't know, you're doing to go back to cloud-based enterprise developer tools or something, and it's like, I don't know, your teammate on your left and right might be there punching the clock to get that bonus at the end of the year so they can have a pontoon boat or something. It's not necessarily life or death stuff. So you have slightly different interests, and like ideally you're working towards the same goal, but also people kind of have their own individual agendas. And I don't have a judgment of that. I just think that's reality, and it's something to be aware of when you're operating and when you're being a teammate. But I think the best thing to do is to be as helpful as possible to your team, to give your best effort, and also to contribute in a way that creates the maximum opportunity, like for your team, for the business, for your users, and hopefully for yourself.
Brilliant. Yeah, it
awesome.
really does come down to ultimately helping others, to move through that and creating the environment where that's possible. But then, yeah, right. It's a point of like, well, everybody's friends in a race. You don't make it to the end of the race without each other. But then it's like when it's that last lap or it's that sprint, that last 150 meters, all right, it's on. So, yeah. And yeah, different stakes, right? We're Nielsen's racing worlds, and I'm just trying to get a podium at Land Park. So it's
yeah, or I don't know, maybe somebody's trying to finish the turkey trot, like who knows,
yeah,
whatever the case may be. And again, that's different than some other context that might be, in some professions, you're in truly life and death environments, and it feels like a battle of good versus evil potentially, right? So it's a little different than, we're selling copiers or whatever it is you might be doing. And also, like, no disrespect to people selling copiers, like there's honor and dignity in all hard work, in my opinion.
100%.
And I mean, I guess that's a good, segue. Drew and I have yet to do a lightning round, but you seem to be quite the candidate for it with your Choose the Hard Way podcast. I'm just curious, right? You said, there's a difference. There's hard work to be done in every domain. I'd love to hear like the top 3, top 5, things you've learned, stories you've heard in quick hits from the Choose the Hard Way podcast, right? Who's taking hard work and applying it to everything?
Yeah, I honestly, Jason, I don't know if I'm capable of doing that, but I think a couple of things that I could synthesize from doing 100 episodes. I think really the main point that I keep thinking about more and more is the one I shared at the beginning of this conversation, which is don't try to be someone else. I mean, you can have aspirations of, I want to be the best in the world at thing X. And, you might have some sense of like, what is your personal best, but don't try to be somebody else. So like, that's number one, like just be the maximum version of yourself. The second thing that I would say, and I think it's related to that point, I don't think people often reflect on this, but if we think about what's happening with AI right now, for example, and it must be trillions of dollars that are being spent on trying to make computers smarter and more effective than humans. If you're listening to this, unless you're AI and you're crawling this, you're a human. And that means that you have a mind that's more advanced than almost all technology that's in existence. And technology generally hasn't caught up to what you were born with. And that's pretty remarkable. So, we think about the need to consume things and to do things to become more. But I think we also have to look within ourselves, because I truly believe that we contain all knowledge that we need. And I think what happens over the course of a lifetime is that hopefully people get more connected to the information that they already have in their mind versus needing to seek out things that are outside of themselves. So I think that's another one. Like, all answers you need might actually be things that you presently have today that you haven't been able to access. And, there are a lot of different techniques that you might use to do that. So I think that's the second thing. The third thing I would say is the importance of presence. And I think of presence as just the ability to set everything else aside and just to be there for whatever's happening. You don't need to be in another place. You don't need to be doing something else. You don't need to be traveling forward to the future in your mind. You don't need to be looking backward at what you did or failed to do. I think the ability to be here now and be present is one of the most important things that we can do. And this it might sound counterintuitive because I'm someone who hosts 2 podcasts, and I bet I've done or been on more than 200 podcasts at this point. But I think sometimes people can conflate consuming information with actually doing the work to create change. So I think it's cool. Like, I listen to a lot of podcasts. I listen to a lot of audiobooks. And for me, one of the things I've learned from doing my podcast, and why my podcast personally really focuses on, I try to just talk to my guests about specific stories from the trajectory of their life, kind of like we're doing today. And I actually don't really get into the like tips and tricks kind of stuff, because for me, the point of my podcast is more about giving people the feeling, the motivation, the inspiration to want to go out and do hard things with people they care about, because I truly think that's when the best things in life happen, like whether that's in business or from a sporting point of view, or even with families. For anyone, I mean, everyone who's listening to this is, again, like, you're a human being, you're a part of some family, whether it's a family of origin or a family that you've chosen of friends. And, some tough things happen as you grow together, and that's just part of the journey. So I think that's another important point. Don't conflate consuming information with actually putting it into practice. You have to live to do that. So I think it's cool to listen to stuff and to read stuff, and I do a lot of it, and I think it's an important part of growing as a human. But the actual growth happens when you step into the arena, you take the chance. Going back to this idea of, you've done the group ride 10, 20 times, you've watched the other people sprint or go to the front and take pulls, why not you? I think that's an important question to ask. And I think that's what some people who are really high performers, are the best in the world at their discipline, some of them do it intuitively. For other people, it might be harder. They might have various challenges to get to the point of being able to ask themselves this question. But instead of thinking about why you can't do something, ask yourself the question, why not me? Why not? Like, why can't you do it? Why can't you be the CEO of something? Why can't you start something? Why can't you be the best in the world at something? Why can't you become the maximum version of yourself? And I think when you get into that mode, instead of, I think, as can happen to anyone, just kind of being overwhelmed by, life can be tough. Things pop up that block you maybe from doing what you want to do. But like, everything is, you can triage anything through just like getting into this mindset of, yeah, why not me? Why wouldn't I be the person to do this thing, versus that's something that other people do? And then I would say the final thing is, it's hard work. Like, that is a common denominator for people who have sustained levels of being the best version of themselves and high performance, is they're people who work hard. And, that some people are like extremely gifted. Some people are extremely lucky, and that's cool. It's good to be gifted. It's also good to have good luck. We all need luck sometimes. But I truly believe that if you want to have sustained high performance over time, and this is what I've seen from the guests on my show, there are people who work their asses off like all the time. And they also, part of that is having that capacity to downregulate and be present, ideally, in other areas of their life when they need to show up. And that's probably the final point I would make, is like, you got to be able to shut it off too. So it's not just about going to the highest level of whatever you want to do. I don't know. You could be the very best in the world at something, and if when you go home, your family thinks you're an asshole, like, are you a successful person?
Probably
Yeah.
not.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think it depends on like, is family
Well,
important to you or not? Or
Right. Maybe this comes back to the right. Everyone has different denominators. Everyone has
yeah,
different inputs that they care about. I would hope that most people in this world care about those around them. But I think we can all point to someone in our lives or someone in the media where that's not the case.
no, that never happens.
No, never.
Yeah. But yeah, I mean, that's kind of like another thing to consider, which when we think about yeah, just like high performance generally, or being the best in the world or the best in category at something, it's not normal. Like
No.
by definition, it's extremely abnormal to be great at something, and that also means there's likely to be imbalances in other areas, and those are things that you need to pay attention to.
Yeah.
I wanted to say one other thing, because we were talking about this idea of reaching out to people, cultivating a network, and growing in that way. And I also think whoever you are, whatever level you're at, that goes both ways. Like, always open the door and help people who, who knock on your door, that, have the same desire that you do to go to another level, and help them out.
Yeah.
So you got to give back as well. And there are a lot of different ways to do that, but I think that that's a really critical, at least to me, I think that's a really critical part of, being a human being and being a professional, is make sure that you're giving back.
Absolutely agreed on that.
Yeah. 100%.
Awesome. Andrew, I just want to say thank you so much for joining us today. Like, really just a deep level of conversation, so many points hit on, plenty of analogies between endurance, endurance sport, and also vocational or professional endeavors. And honestly, just really appreciate your time and your engagement with us today.
Yeah, well, Drew and Jason, thanks so much for having me. I think two other takeaways I have from this conversation. I really enjoyed chopping it up with you all, but I'm like, I've got whiteboard envy, and Drew, I think I need to get that mic that you have. I'm kind of envious right now.
I'll send you like DJI, like it's fantastic.
Shout out DJI.
Yeah.
And maybe I'll go buy a guitar to put behind me, even though no one wants to hear me play it.
Hey, you just have to put in the work, Jason. Just
Yeah,
put in the hard yards.
absolutely.
You'll be breaking away from the guitar pack in no time.
There you
Awesome.
go. Awesome. Well, Andrew, thank you so much. This was a pleasure. I've been consuming the content on Choose the Hard Way for a while, and it's been great to be connected and learn from you for what's probably been about a year now. As
Yeah,
we've been
likewise.
talking about how to find those people in your domain or the domain you want to be a part of that are doing cool shit. Yeah,
Brilliant.
awesome.
Speaking of doing cool shit, I'll just do a quick shout out to our unofficial official sponsors, Live Data Technologies, Jason's shop, and my shop, SCS Cloud. Happy to have their support in producing this podcast on an interval for all of you. And thanks again to our guest, Andrew Vontz. Super appreciated. And Revenue Riders, out.